Welcome to the dark side of Hollywood. The same room, the same crime, but when the flash goes out, the man becomes an immortal legend, while the young woman is erased forever. Robert Mitchum wasn't caught by accident. He was chosen to shine. Lila Leeds wasn't an accomplice. She was the scapegoat. Behind the shocking 1948 scandal, evidence suggests not justice, but a cold-blooded script written by the most powerful moguls. This is the naked truth about the dark drama of Lila Leeds and Robert Mitchum, the most sophisticated and ruthless love trap in Hollywood history. Hollywood in 1948 was a city in panic. While the world saw the golden age of Bogart and Bacall, studio executives saw their empire cracking. The government was attacking their monopolies. Television was stealing their audience, and the morality police were hunting for scandal. To prove they were clean without losing money, the studios mastered the art of the spin. When the LAPD targeted their stars, executives saw an opportunity disguised as a disaster. They wouldn't destroy Mitchum. They would discipline him. They needed a public execution that they could turn into a controlled demolition. Robert Mitchum was the perfect target. Unlike the polished Cary Grant or the patriotic Jimmy Stewart, Mitchum was a creature of the earth. A former hobo who had ridden the rails and worked on a chain gang, he viewed Hollywood with cynical amusement. He drank hard, fought in bars, and refused to play the game. Worst of all, he was intelligent. He knew exactly how much he was worth, and that made him dangerous. RKO didn't just want to punish him, they wanted to own him. And to do that, they needed a sacrificial lamb. Mitchum was becoming unmanageable. Threats of ruin didn't work on him. He had a fatalistic streak, a noir soul that believed everything was doomed anyway. So RKO needed a leash. They needed a mugshot. They needed a shameful vice crime to hold over his head, forcing him into a morality clause that would strip him of his bargaining power. But you can't just arrest Robert Mitchum at a restaurant. He was too smart, too guarded. You had to lure him into a hole. You had to create an environment where he felt safe enough to let his guard down, to take off the armor of the movie star and indulge in his favorite secret vice, marijuana. In 1948, marijuana was not the recreational substance of the counterculture revolution. That was still 20 years away. In 1948, reefer was the drug of the jazz musician, the Mexican laborer, and the degenerate. It was considered a gateway to madness. The press called it the devil's weed. To be caught with it was a mark of low character. It was dirty. It was exactly the kind of dirt RKO needed to smudge onto Mitchum's white suit. Mitchum was too guarded to be caught in a random sweep. They needed bait. Lila Leeds was born Lila Lee Wilkinson in Kansas. She came to Hollywood with the same desperate hunger that fueled thousands of other girls. She wanted to be somebody. She had the raw materials. She was stunningly beautiful with platinum blonde hair, a figure that stopped traffic, and a face that could shift from innocent to sultry in a heartbeat. She looked so much like Lana Turner that people often stopped her on the street asking for autographs. But looking like a star and being a star are two different things. Lila was stuck in the purgatory of the starlet. She was signed to small contracts, played bit parts, and worked as a cigarette girl at Ciro's, the legendary nightclub on the Sunset Strip. Ciro's was the epicenter of the Hollywood ecosystem. It was where the lions came to feed. Lila was part of the scenery, a beautiful object to be looked at, flirted with, and used. It was at Ciro's that she fell into the reefer crowd. She was young, barely 20, and she wanted to fit in. She wanted to be cool. when the musicians and the actors passed around the hand-rolled cigarettes in the back alleys or the private booths, she partook. It made her feel like an insider. It made her feel like she belonged to the secret club. She met Robert Mitchum in this hazy underworld. Mitchum liked her. She was fun. She was pretty. And she didn't ask him for anything. She wasn't trying to get a role. She was just trying to have a good time. To Mitchum, she was a relief from the sharks at the studio. To the sharks, however, she was an opportunity. Weeks before the bust, Lila Leeds made a curious decision. She didn't rent an apartment in Hollywood or a bungalow in Beverly Hills. She rented a cabin at 8443 Ridpath Drive in Laurel Canyon. Even today, Laurel Canyon is a labyrinth. The roads are narrow, winding, and confusing. In 1948, it was a wilderness. The cabin was isolated, hidden behind thick brush, accessible only by a steep set of stairs. It was the kind of place you choose when you want to disappear. Why did a 20-year-old struggling actress rent a hideout? Who paid for it? The rent was not cheap. Historical analysis suggests that Lila was steered toward this property. There were fixers in Hollywood, men who solved problems for the studios, men who straddled the line between the police department and the criminal underworld. These men knew that to trap Mitchum, they needed a controlled environment. A hotel room was too public. A studio lot was too risky. But a private cabin in the hills, leased by a naive girl? That was a sound stage. The house was perfect for surveillance. It was isolated enough that no neighbors would accidentally intervene, yet accessible enough for a raid. It was a glass jar. The role of the informant was played by a man named Robin Ford. Ford was a real estate agent, a hanger-on, a man who floated in the social circles of the stars without ever being one himself. He was a friend of Mitchum. He was also, according to persistent rumors and the behavior he exhibited that night, a police plant. On the day of September 1st, 1948, the phone lines in Los Angeles were buzzing. Mitchum received a call. He was bored. His wife Dorothy was out of town in Delaware. He was alone in Hollywood, restless, itching for a distraction. The voice on the phone, likely Ford or another intermediary, suggested dropping by Lila's new place, just a casual hang, a housewarming. Mitchum agreed. Why wouldn't he? He was the king of Hollywood. He went where he pleased. But there was a strange detail about that afternoon. Mitchum later recalled that he was asked repeatedly by different people exactly where he would be that evening. It felt like a confirmation call. It felt like someone checking the schedule. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Police Department's narcotics squad was gathering. Sergeant A.M. Barr was briefing his men. They weren't responding to a frantic 911 call from a neighbor complaining about noise. They were organizing a tactical strike. They knew the address, they knew the occupants, they knew the timing, and crucially, they had alerted the press. The Los Angeles Examiner didn't just stumble upon the raid, they were tipped off. A tip-off that precise doesn't come from a neighbor. It comes from the architects of the raid. The headline was already written before the handcuffs were slapped on. They just needed the photo to go with it. As the sun began to dip below the dry hills of the canyon, Lila Leeds was preparing her home. She was excited. Robert Mitchum was coming over. For a girl trying to climb the ladder, having the biggest star in the world in your living room was a coup. She invited her roommate, Vicki Evans, a dancer. She wanted a party. She wanted to impress him. She didn't know that the bushes outside her window were filling up with men. She didn't know that every car driving up Ridpath Drive was being watched. She was arranging the pillows on the sofa, checking her makeup in the mirror, looking at the reflection of a girl who was about to make it big. She had no idea that she was looking at a ghost. The stage was set. The actors were taking their places. The script called for a tragedy, but with a specific distribution of pain. The man would turn his sentence into a sales boost. The woman would serve the same time, but receive a lifetime of shame. Mitchum pulled up to the house in his car. He walked up the steps, his gait loose and easy. He knocked on the door. Lila opened it, smiling, bathed in the warm yellow light of the cabin. She welcomed him in. The door closed. The trap was armed. The door to 8443 Ridpath Drive clicked shut, sealing the four of them inside a wooden box that was about to become the most photographed room in America. The atmosphere inside the cabin was not the debauched, drug-fueled orgy that the newspapers would later describe to a scandalized public. It was mundane. It was quiet. It was the sort of low-key gathering that happens in thousands of homes every Friday night. But because one of the men sitting on the sofa was Robert Mitchum, the mundane was about to be transmuted into a felony. Mitchum moved with the languid grace of a large cat, shedding his jacket, loosening his tie, and settling into the furniture with a sigh that spoke of a man tired of being looked at. He was looking for sanctuary, a few hours where he didn't have to be the tough guy on the poster, but simply Bob, a guy who liked jazz and quiet conversation. Lila Leeds, flushed with the triumph of successfully hosting the biggest star in Hollywood, fluttered around the room like a moth near a flame, emptying ashtrays that weren't full and offering drinks. She was performing the role of the sophisticated hostess, unaware that the audience for her performance was crouching in the ivy outside her window. The other players in this chamber drama took their positions. Vicki Evans, Lila's roommate and a dancer with the kind of street smarts Lila lacked, sat in the corner. And then there was Robin Ford. If you freeze the frame here, you can see the tension in Ford's shoulders. He was the bridge between the target and the trap. He had driven Mitchum here. He had facilitated the evening. And now he was waiting for the cue. The air in the cabin grew thick, not with tension, but with the false sense of security that precedes an ambush. They talked about work. They talked about the heat. They talked about the absurdity of the movie business. Mitchum was charming, his voice a low rumble that filled the small space, making jokes about the studio heads, unaware that the studio heads had essentially signed the warrant that was currently in Sergeant Barr's pocket. Then came the ritual. In 1948, smoking marijuana was not a casual act. It was a ceremony of the underground. It required preparation. The curtains were drawn tight. The lights were dimmed. It was a secret handshake shared among musicians and rebels. A brown paper bag was produced. Inside were the marijuana cigarettes, rolled tight, smelling of earth and rebellion. They were passed around. A match was struck. The flame flared, illuminating Mitchum's heavy-lidded eyes for a split second before settling into the orange glow of the cherry. The smoke drifted up toward the wooden beams of the ceiling, a sweet, pungent cloud that would serve as the primary evidence for the prosecution. Mitchum took a drag. Lila took a drag. It was a moment of communal relaxation, an exhale of the day's stress. At 12:05 a.m., the world exploded. There was no knock. The door didn't open. It disintegrated inward under the force of a boot. The sound was deafening in the small, quiet room. The splintering of wood, the heavy thud of leather shoes on the floorboards, and the shouting of men who had been waiting in the dark for hours to release their adrenaline. Police officers, freeze, nobody move. The cabin was instantly flooded with men in suits and uniforms. Sergeant A.M. Barr led the charge, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the room for the smoke. But the police were not the first thing Lila Leeds saw. The first thing she saw was the light. The flashbulbs popping were like gunfire. Pop, pop, pop. a stroboscopic nightmare that froze the occupants in moments of grotesque terror. The photographers from the Los Angeles Examiner pushed past the uniformed officers, their cameras raised, capturing the scene before the smoke had even cleared. This was a violation of procedure so flagrant it bordered on farce. In a legitimate raid, the press waits at the station. In a setup, the press secures the perimeter. They needed the money shot. They needed Robert Mitchum, the idol of millions, holding the smoking gun. Mitchum's reaction to the invasion is the stuff of Hollywood legend, but it revealed more about his character than any role he ever played. A normal man would have jumped up. A guilty man would have tried to run. A terrified man would have begged. Mitchum did none of those things. He remained seated on the sofa, his posture unchanged. He looked at the gun barrel pointed at his chest, then looked at the photographer, then looked at the joint that had been knocked to the floor. His pulse barely seemed to register the chaos. He understood the physics of the situation immediately. He saw Robin Ford standing unmolested in the corner. He saw the readiness of the press. He realized, with the clarity of a man who has read thousands of scripts, that he was in the third act of a tragedy written by R.K.O. "Well," he said, his voice cutting through the shouting like a knife through butter, "this is the bitter end of everything. I guess it's all over now." It was a line of dialogue delivered with such cool detachment that it unnerved the police. They wanted him to fight. They wanted him to act like a criminal so they could treat him like one. Instead, he treated them like annoying extras on a set he wanted to leave. Lila Leeds, however, was not acting. She was disintegrating. When the door burst open, she let out a scream that was not captured in the police report, but echoed in the memories of everyone present. She scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp, pressing herself against the wall as if she could melt into the plaster. Her eyes were wide, white circles of panic. She was wearing a simple blouse and skirt, but in the harsh glare of the flashbulbs, she looked naked. She looked exposed. She didn't have Mitchum's cynical armor. She didn't have his millions. She knew with a terrifying primal instinct that the men with the badges weren't there to arrest a movie star. They were there to destroy a girl. The officers swarmed the room. They grabbed the evidence. They scooped up the roaches from the ashtray. They bagged the remaining cigarettes. They searched the women's purses. It was a flurry of aggressive motion designed to intimidate. Sergeant Barr loomed over Mitchum, demanding to know whose dope it was. Mitchum, ever the gentleman in his own twisted way, didn't point a finger at Lila. He didn't point a finger at Robin Ford. He simply shrugged. He knew it didn't matter whose it was. Possession was 9/10 of the law, and the photo of him in the room was 10/10 of the conviction. The most chilling aspect of the raid was the behavior of Robin Ford. While Lila was hyperventilating and Vicki Evans was shouting protests, Ford was quiet. He stood near the door almost as if he were waiting for a pat on the back. The police handled him gently. They didn't rough him up. They didn't shove his face into the carpet. In the chaotic ballet of the arrest, Ford was the only one who seemed to know the choreography. He was the Judas who had delivered the Savior, and he was watching the crucifixion with professional detachment. They were hauled out of the cabin and into the waiting squad cars. The ride down the winding roads of Laurel Canyon was a descent from the dream factory into the meat grinder. Mitchum sat in the back of the black and white, silent, watching the city lights flicker through the window. He was likely calculating the damages. He was thinking about his wife, Dorothy. He was thinking about his contract. He was thinking about the morality clause. But he wasn't shaking. Beside him, or in the car behind him, Lila Leeds was weeping. She was asking the officers questions they wouldn't answer. "What's going to happen to me? Who called you? Why are you doing this?" Her tears were not an admission of guilt. They were the physiological response to a life being dismantled. The arrival at the police station was a second premiere. If the raid at the cabin was the exclusive screening, the booking at the station was the general release. Reporters swarmed the entrance, a chaotic sea of fedoras and flashbulbs surging against the precinct steps. The news had traveled across the wires instantly, faster than the squad cars themselves. Robert Mitchum, arrested and doped in. The phrase doped in was already being typeset in newsrooms across the country, inked in bold, scandalous font. It conjured images of opium wars, dim lanterns and squalor, not a clean, well-lit wooden cabin with a few friends sharing a quiet evening. The narrative was being shaped in real time, constructed brick by editors who knew that a scandal involving the bad boy of Hollywood was worth its weight in gold. Mitchum was the fallen idol, the rough-edged hero brought low. Lila was the temptress, the siren in the smoke. They were marched inside for processing, the heavy doors swinging shut to muffle the shouting press, though the strobing lights still flickered through the frosted glass. The smell of the station, stale coffee, floor wax, industrial disinfectant, and misery replaced the smell of sagebrush and marijuana. The air here was heavy, recycled, and charged with the static of bureaucratic judgment. The booking officer, a man whose face had seen every variety of Los Angeles sin, asked for names. Mitchum gave his with a smirk, a low rumble of a voice that didn't waver. Leeds gave hers with a whisper, her voice fracturing under the fluorescent hum. Then came the mugshots. These two photographs, taken minutes apart against the same gray slate, serve as the definitive psychological portraits of the event, capturing the exact moment their paths diverged. When Robert Mitchum stood against the height chart, he didn't slouch. He looked straight into the lens, locking eyes with the camera as if it were a director he didn't particularly respect. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his career or his freedom. He looked like a man who knew a secret the rest of the room hadn't figured out yet. His lips were curled in a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, a gesture of defiance that would become iconic. His eyes were heavy, hooded, and utterly devoid of fear. It was a look of pure insolence, a masterclass in nonchalance. It said to the studio, to the police, and to the public, "You can arrest me, you can shame me, you can drag me through the mud, but you cannot break me." He stood against the height chart with the instinctive cunning of a street fighter. He knew he wasn't just a suspect. He was a product. In Hollywood, you don't scrap a money printing machine for getting a little dirty. That smirk wasn't arrogance, it was a winning bet. When Lila Leeds stood against the same wall, the camera captured a tragedy in real time. Her platinum hair, usually coiffed to perfection, was messy and wild. Her face was pale, stripped of the glamour of the night, revealing the terrified young woman beneath the starlit veneer. Her eyes were wide, haunted, staring past the lens into a future that had suddenly gone black. There was no smirk. There was no defiance. There was only the look of a person who realizes she is holding the bag. She looked guilty, not of the crime of possession, but of the sin of being vulnerable in a predatory ecosystem. She looked like a woman who knew she had no currency to trade. Mitchum had box office receipts, contracts, and a studio desperate to protect its investment. Lila had nothing but her youth. And in Hollywood, youth is a depreciating asset, easily replaced by the next busload of hopefuls arriving at Union Station. They were placed in separate holding cells, and the physical separation mirrored the societal one. Mitchum's cell became a receiving line, a bizarre extension of a VIP lounge. Officers stopped by not to interrogate him, but to ask for autographs for their wives. They offered him cigarettes, tobacco this time, lighting them for him through the bars. They joked with him, slapping the metal with camaraderie. "Hey, Bob, tough break," they said, their tone implying that getting caught with weed was just bad luck, a masculine mishap. He was treated like a dignitary who had committed a minor faux pas, like spilling wine on a tablecloth at a state dinner. He was one of the boys, a man's man who had just happened to get caught having a good time. He charmed them, leaning back on the cot, spinning yarns. He turned the jailhouse into a salon. Lila's cell was a cage. She was isolated, the silence of her confinement broken only by the judgmental whispers of the staff. The matrons looked at her with disgust, their faces hard and unforgiving. To them, she wasn't a starlet or a victim. She was a dope fiend, a threat to decency. In 1948, a woman who smoked marijuana was considered morally loose, sexually deviant, and dangerous, a corrupter of men. She was stripped of her dignity, processed with a cold efficiency that made her feel like contraband. She was treated not as a victim of a setup, but as the architect of Mitchum's fall. "You're the one who dragged him down," their eyes seemed to say. "You're the siren who lured the good man onto the rocks." She sat on the hard cot, hugging her knees, listening to the murmurs from the men's block, hearing the laughter echoing from where Mitchum was holding court. And she realized the true geography of her situation. They were in the same building, charged with the same crime, captured in the same raid, but they were on different planets. The trap had worked perfectly. The wolf had been caught and would be domesticated, his wildness turned into a marketing hook. The lamb had been caught and would be slaughtered to satisfy the censors. But the true drama was not in the arrest. It was in the performance that followed. The sun rose over the Los Angeles County Courthouse, illuminating a scene that looked less like a legal proceeding and more like the premiere of a Cecil B. DeMille epic. The trial of the people versus Robert Mitchum and Lila Leeds was the hottest ticket in town, drawing crowds that spilled down the steps and into the street. It was the reefer madness trial of the century, a morality play scripted by the district attorney and produced by RKO Radio Pictures. But the architect of the betrayal in the courtroom was not the judge nor the prosecutor. It was the defense attorney, Jerry Giesler. In 1948, Giesler was the fixer of last resort, the legendary shield of the Hollywood elite. If a studio executive killed a mistress, they called Giesler. If a star was caught in bed with a minor, they called Giesler. He was the man who made felonies disappear into the fog of legal technicalities. He was a legal magician who could turn a murder charge into a justifiable homicide with a wave of his hand and a perfectly timed objection. So, when RKO hired Giesler to represent Robert Mitchum, the public assumed that Mitchum would walk free. They assumed Giesler would tear the police case apart, expose the entrapment, reveal the hidden microphones, and humiliate the Los Angeles Examiner for their unethical presence at the raid. But Jerry Giesler's loyalty lay with the studio, not the client. And the studio's strategy was cold. Do not get him off. Ensure a conviction to humble him. This is the pivotal twist in the setup. The moment the legal defense morphed into a corporate disciplining. A true defense attorney, one whose loyalty lay with the client, would have screamed entrapment from the rooftops. He would have subpoenaed the phone records to show the coordination between Robin Ford and the narcotics squad. He would have put Robin Ford on the stand and grilled him about his relationship with the police. He would have asked why the press was hiding in the bushes before a warrant was even served. He would have turned the trial into an indictment of the LAPD's corruption and the tabloid press's complicity. But Giesler did none of that. His strategy was silence. He advised Mitchum and Leeds to waive their right to a jury trial. This was a fatal maneuver, a calculated surrender. A jury might have sympathized with the handsome rogue and the weeping girl. A jury might have hated the heavy-handed tactics of the police invading a private home. A judge, however, specifically Judge Clement D. Nye, a man with political ambitions and close ties to the establishment, would do exactly what was expected of him. By waiving the jury, Giesler ensured there would be no grand speeches, no exposing of the dirty laundry, and no risk of Mitchum walking away completely unscathed. The studio wanted a conviction to humble their star, to force him to activate the morality clause in his contract that would give them total control over his life. They needed him to be a convicted felon, just a little bit, stained enough to be owned, but not destroyed. Lila Leeds, sitting beside Mitchum at the defense table, was the collateral damage of this legal strategy. She didn't have her own high-powered attorney to advocate for her specific interests. She was effectively represented by the same machine that was processing Mitchum. If Mitchum went down, she had to go down with him. If she fought, she would be fighting alone against the LAPD, the DA, and the monolithic power of RKO. She sat there pale and trembling, wearing a modest suit she had bought specifically for the trial, trying to look like a Sunday school teacher rather than a Hollywood party girl. She looked like a child who had wandered into a boardroom meeting where her execution was the only item on the agenda. The trial itself was a farce, a procedural formality. The prosecution presented the evidence: the marijuana cigarettes found in the cabin, the roaches in the ashtray, and the testimony of Sergeant Barr. They painted a picture of a debauched reefer den where morals were loose and the smoke was thick. They described the scene as if it were an opium den in Shanghai, fraught with danger and depravity, not a quiet cabin in Laurel Canyon where friends were listening to records. When it was the defense's turn, Giesler played his part perfectly. He offered a nolo contendere defense, not admitting guilt but not fighting the charges either. He presented Mitchum as a man who had made a mistake, a humble actor who respected the law, and was willing to take his medicine. It was a performance designed to salvage Mitchum's public image while ensuring his legal conviction. He threw Mitchum on the mercy of the court, knowing that the court had already decided the punishment in a backroom deal. He spoke of Mitchum's cooperation, his regret, his value to the community. He barely mentioned Leeds. For Lila, there was no mercy. The prosecutor, seizing on the temptress narrative, subtly framed her as the instigator. She was the one who rented the cabin. She was the hostess. Mitchum was just the guest who got caught up in her web. The unspoken argument was clear. Men have needs. Men make mistakes. But women who facilitate vice are the root of the evil. Lila sat silent, unable to speak, unable to defend herself, watching the men in suits trade her future for political capital. She was the designated scapegoat, the vessel into which all the moral outrage of the era was poured. Then came the verdict. Judge Nye looked down from the bench, his face a mask of stern, paternalistic disapproval. He found both defendants guilty of conspiracy to possess marijuana. The sentence was swift: 60 days in the county jail and 2 years of probation. On paper, it was a light sentence. 60 days is a blink of an eye in the legal system, but in 1948, for a movie star, it was an earthquake. It was the first time a major Hollywood icon had been sentenced to jail for drugs. The courtroom erupted. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sensationalism. Mitchum took the sentence with the same stoic cool he had displayed during the raid. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and gave that famous half-smile. He didn't look like a man going to prison. He looked like a man going to a location shoot. He knew the script. He knew he could do 60 days standing on his head. He knew that the studio had probably arranged for him to have a soft time, a distinct separation from the hardcore criminal population. He was playing the role of the unbothered rebel to the very end. Lila Leeds did not smile. When the gavel banged down, she flinched as if she had been struck. 60 days. To her, it wasn't a location shoot. It was the end of her life. She knew what happened to girls who went to jail. She knew the stigma. She knew that while Mitchum would emerge as a tough guy, she would emerge as a jailbird. The double standard was not theoretical. It was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel the doors of Hollywood slamming shut one by one. She could feel the judgment of the world settling on her skin like soot. The aftermath of the sentencing revealed the true nature of the Hollywood caste system. Mitchum was surrounded by handlers. His agent was there, whispering assurances. The studio publicists were there, already spinning the story for the morning papers. Mitchum accepts his punishment like a man, a lesson learned for the screen idol. He was whisked away in a cloud of importance, a valuable asset being transported to storage. Lila stood alone. Her roommate, Vicki Evans, who had been acquitted due to lack of evidence, another suspicious detail suggesting the net was only meant for specific fish, tried to comfort her, but the isolation was absolute. The press surrounded her, not to hear her side of the story, but to get a photo of the crying shame. They zoomed in on her tears, capturing her disintegration for the front page. They captioned the photos with words like ruined and disgraced. Then came the separation. Robert Mitchum was sent to the Wayside Honor Rancho. The name itself sounds like a resort, evoking images of dusty trails and cowboy camaraderie rather than penal servitude. It was a minimum security farm in Castaic, California, a facility designed for the reformation of the nonviolent, a place where the punishment was boredom rather than brutality. It was a jail, yes, but it was a jail built for low-level offenders who the state deemed redeemable. There were no bars on the windows, only the open expanse of the Santa Clarita Valley. The inmates worked in the fields, breathing fresh air, their hands in the dirt, their lungs filling with the scent of sage rather than the stench of confinement. The studio, realizing they could not hide the incarceration, decided to embrace it. In a stroke of Machiavellian genius, RKO turned Mitchum's incarceration into a reality show, the first of its kind. They allowed photographers into the prison, granting them access that would be unthinkable for a common criminal. They staged photos of Mitchum wearing denim dungarees, a wardrobe choice that looked less like a prisoner's uniform and more like a costume for a role in The Grapes of Wrath. They captured him mopping the floor, peeling potatoes in the mess hall, and mixing concrete under the California sun. The images were carefully curated to strip away the drug addict stigma and replace it with something far more palatable to the American public, the working man. He looked rugged. He looked unpretentious. He looked like a man who, despite his Hollywood salary, knew the value of hard labor. The public ate it up. The narrative shifted seismically. Here was a movie star who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Here was a man who took his punishment without whining, a stoic figure accepting his fate with a grin and a shovel. The letters of support poured into the prison by the sackful, overwhelming the mailroom staff. Women sent him cakes fantasizing about the lonely, rugged man on the farm. Men sent him cigars, respecting his refusal to grovel. The shame of the conviction evaporated, burned away by the California sun, and was replaced by a new outlaw mystique. RKO's box office returns actually soared during his sentence. The gamble had paid off spectacularly. They had disciplined their star, breaking his leverage in contract negotiations, but they had accidentally made him more popular than ever. He was no longer just an actor, he was a folk hero. Lila Leeds was sent to the Los Angeles County Jail for Women. There were no photographers there. There were no press releases issued to soften the blow. There was no farm with fresh air, no horizon to look at, no soil to till. It was a concrete box filled with the forgotten women of the city, prostitutes, addicts, thieves, and the mentally ill. Upon entry, the stripping of her identity was immediate and total. She was stripped of her clothes, her name, and her dignity. The fashionable dress she had worn to court was bagged and tagged, replaced by a gray uniform made of coarse industrial fabric that scratched her skin and smelled of strong detergent and other people's sweat. She was thrown into a cell with women who didn't care about movies, women who didn't know or care about RKO or box office receipts. These were women fighting for survival in a brutal system. And to them, Lila was just fresh meat, a soft girl from the hills who didn't know the rules of the cage. In jail, Lila went through withdrawal. It was a physical and psychological purging, not just from the marijuana, which she had used to numb the anxiety of her precarious existence, but from the adrenaline of her life, the parties, the auditions, the phone calls, the hope. The silence of the cell was terrifying, a vacuum that sucked the air out of her lungs. In that silence, she had time to think, and the thoughts were sharper than any blade. She had time to realize that Robin Ford, the man who had introduced the police to the party, had disappeared into the ether, his job done. She had time to realize that Jerry Giesler, the great defender, hadn't asked a single question in her defense, hadn't raised a single objection to protect her. She realized with a clarity that only hits at rock bottom that she had been the patsy. While Mitchum was joking with the guards at the Honor Rancho, charming the warden with Hollywood anecdotes and planning his next movie role, between shifts in the vegetable garden, Lila was fighting off unwanted advances and scrubbing toilets in anonymity. She was learning the hard lesson of the setup. The trap is designed to catch the wolf, but the wolf, if he is strong enough, valuable enough, can chew through the net. The lamb just gets tangled and strangles. But for Lila, the strangulation didn't stop when the sentence ended. While Mitchum's time on the farm was merely a pause in his career, a brief intermission in a blockbuster life, Lila's time in the cell was the beginning of a permanent erasure. The iron gates of the Los Angeles County Jail for Women clanged shut behind Lila Leeds, a sound that was supposed to mark the end of her punishment, but actually signaled the beginning of her exile. It was early 1949. She walked out into the California sunshine, wearing the same clothes she had been arrested in, but they hung differently on her frame now. She had lost weight, the stress carving hollows into her cheeks. Her skin, deprived of sunlight and proper nutrition for 60 days, had a translucent, sickly pallor that no amount of foundation could hide. There was no limousine waiting for her at the curb. There were no studio publicists armed with press releases about her rehabilitation or her triumphant return. There was only the harsh, indifferent noise of the city and the crushing realization that she was now a woman marked by a scarlet letter that was invisible to the eye but blindingly obvious to the industry. Across town, Robert Mitchum's release was a coronation. He emerged from the wayside Honor Rancho looking like he had just returned from a spa retreat. His skin was tanned deep brown from working in the fields. His muscles were toned from the physical labor. He looked healthier and more vibrant than he had in years. He was greeted by his wife, Dorothy, who stood by him with the stoic loyalty of a woman who knew that her husband's paycheck was the only thing keeping their world spinning. The press corps, the same men who had lurked in the bushes at Laurel Canyon like predators, now fawned over him like loyal subjects. They asked him how it was, treating his incarceration like a quirky vacation. Mitchum, with that trademark sleepy-eyed grin and the easy confidence of a man who knows he has won, delivered another line for the ages. It was just like Palm Springs without the riffraff. The reporters laughed. The public laughed. In that moment, the crime was transmuted into a charming anecdote. Mitchum had successfully rebranded himself from a liability into a rugged anti-hero. He went straight from the jail cell to the set of The Big Steal. The title was ironic. He had indeed stolen his career back from the brink of destruction. For Lila, there was no big steal. There was only the big shutout. She returned to her apartment to find her phone silent. The silence of Hollywood is a heavy, suffocating thing. It is not passive. It is an active force, a wall erected overnight. It is the sound of agents telling their secretaries to say they are in a meeting indefinitely. It is the sound of casting directors tossing headshots into the trash can without a second glance because the liability insurance would be too high. Lila called the friends who had drank her liquor and smoked her cigarettes just months before, the hangers-on who had filled her living room. They were gone. They were terrified that the stink of the Leeds case would rub off on them. In the superstitious village of Los Angeles, bad luck is contagious, and Lila Leeds was considered patient zero of a plague called scandal. She was 21 years old. She had a criminal record. She had no money. And she had a face that everyone recognized but no one wanted to hire. The morality clause that the studios used to control their stars was now used to starve her. RKO, the studio that had orchestrated the entire entrapment to discipline Mitchum, had no use for the debris left in the wake of their operation. They had caught the big fish. The bait was left to rot on the hook. Desperation is a powerful solvent. It dissolves dignity faster than anything else. When the rent came due and the cupboards were bare, Lila Leeds received an offer. It didn't come from MGM or Warner Brothers. It came from the bottom of the barrel. Eureka Productions. This was an outfit that specialized in exploitation films, movies that skirted the edges of the censorship code by promising scandal and titillation under the guise of moral instruction. The producer, a man named Kroger Babb, knew exactly what he was buying. He wasn't hiring an actress to play a role. He was hiring a headline to sell tickets. The project was titled Wild Weed. Later, it would be retitled She Shoulda Said No, to be even more lurid, more accusatory. The premise was a grotesque funhouse mirror of Lila's own life, a distorted reflection designed to mock her tragedy. The script told the story of Ann Lester, a wholesome chorus girl who meets a charming man, smokes a single marijuana cigarette, and immediately descends into a hell of madness, promiscuity, and ruin. Lila sat in the producer's office reading the pages with a sinking heart. It was a humiliation ritual disguised as a screenplay. They wanted her to reenact her own destruction for the camera. They wanted her to simulate the high that had cost her everything. They wanted her to act out the arrest, the shame, the fall. Every line of dialogue was a slap in the face, a reminder of her reality. But the producer pushed a contract across the desk. The money wasn't good. It was a pittance compared to what she had been on track to earn. But it was money, and it was a chance to be on screen again. Lila clinging to the naive hope that if she just worked, if she just showed up and proved she could still act, Hollywood would forgive her, signed the paper. The filming of She Shoulda Said No was a psychological flaying. The budget was non-existent. The sets were cheap cardboard that wobbled if a door was slammed too hard. The director was a hack who screamed at her to look more depraved, to channel her real experience into the scene. When they filmed the party scenes, Lila had to pretend to smoke the very substance that had ruined her life, inhaling prop smoke, while the crew watched with a mixture of pity and voyeurism. She was performing an autopsy on her own reputation, dissecting her trauma for a paying audience. The marketing campaign was even worse, a carnival barker scream of exploitation. The poster screamed, "How bad can a good girl get?" and Lila Leeds' confession. They used her actual mugshot in the advertising, blurring the line between the character and the woman until they were indistinguishable. They weren't selling a movie, they were selling a freak show. When the film was released, it didn't launch a comeback. It cemented her status as a pariah. The reviews were savage, mocking her acting and her circumstances, treating the film as the final nail in her coffin. But the humiliation didn't end with the premiere. Part of her contract required her to tour with the film, to be a traveling exhibit of sin. Lila Leeds was forced to travel across the country to dank movie theaters and high school auditoriums, standing on stage before the screening to give a lecture on the dangers of drugs. The scene was grim, a tableau of absolute defeat. A beautiful young woman, broken and exhausted, standing under a harsh singular spotlight in a town like Topeka or Omaha, reading a prepared speech about how one puff of marijuana destroyed her soul. The audience didn't come to learn. They came to gawk. They came to see the dope fiend from the headlines, to see if she looked crazy, to see if she looked loose. She was a zoo animal on display, pacing the cage of the stage. She answered their prying, invasive questions about Robert Mitchum, forced to smile and say that he was a victim too, protecting the very man whose indifference had sealed her fate. This tour drained the last reserves of her self-respect. She was selling her shame for a train ticket and a hotel room. By 1952, Lila Leeds had fled Los Angeles. She couldn't walk down Sunset Boulevard without seeing the ghosts of what could have been. She moved to Chicago, then to the Midwest, drifting like a piece of wreckage caught in a current. She worked in jazz clubs, not as a headliner, but as a curiosity. "Come see the girl who got busted with Mitchum," was the whisper at the door. And then the prophecy of the studio executives finally fulfilled itself. They had framed her as a junkie to ruin her, and in her ruin, she found the only comfort available. Marijuana was no longer enough to numb the pain of the lost years. She turned to heroin. Heroin is not a social drug. It is not a party drug. It is an oblivion drug. It is the final exit for a person who can no longer bear to look at the world. Lila Leeds, the girl who had once been compared to Lana Turner, began to show the ravages of hard addiction. Her face, once her fortune, grew gaunt. Her arms, once smooth and photographed in evening gowns, became a road map of needle tracks. She drifted into the criminal underworld for real this time. She was arrested for soliciting. She was arrested for possession. Each mugshot showed a woman eroding, fading, disappearing. Lila Leeds was right. In the moments before the raid, she had believed she was on the verge of something great. She had the talent. She had the look. If the police had arrived 5 minutes later, or if they had raided a different house, or if Robert Mitchum had decided to stay home that night, Lila Leeds might have been a star. She might have been in St. John in the Rain. She might have been in Some Like It Hot. But fate is a cruel screenwriter. Throughout her descent, there is no record of Robert Mitchum ever reaching out. He never sent a check. He never offered to pay for rehab. He never mentioned her name in interviews unless specifically asked, and even then, it was with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just a girl I met," he would say. To him, she was a bit player in the movie of his life, a character who appeared in one scene and then was written out. He didn't seem to understand or didn't care to admit that his survival was predicated on her destruction. He was the unsinkable ship. She was the water he displaced. In the late 1950s, a reporter tracked Lila down in a run-down apartment in Los Angeles. She had returned to the city, drawn back like a moth to the light that burned her. She was barely 30, but she looked 50. She was living on welfare. The reporter asked her if she hated Mitchum. Lila, with a grace that she had maintained despite everything, shook her head. "I don't hate him," she said, her voice raspy from years of smoke and hard living. "He did what he had to do. He was a star. I was nobody. That's the rule, isn't it? The big guys walk and the little guys get crushed." It was a moment of profound, heartbreaking clarity. She accepted the injustice not because it was right, but because it was the physics of her world. She understood that she was a sacrifice. The anger had burned out, leaving only a pile of cold ash. The cultural revolution of the 1960s arrived too late for Lila Leeds. While a new generation turned marijuana from a vice into a symbol of rebellion, Lila remained a casualty of a war everyone else had forgotten was even fought. She retreated further into the shadows, a broken relic of a harsher time, finding her only solace in the heroin that cemented her erasure. In stark contrast, the final act of this drama saw Robert Mitchum carved into the granite of Hollywood legend. He aged into a magnificent ruin, the sleepy-eyed giant who commanded respect in films like The Friends of Eddie Coyle and Cape Fear. Whenever the scandal of 1948 was raised, Mitchum would dismiss it with a wave of his hand and a cloud of tobacco smoke. It was just a lot of smoke in a small room. For him, it was a charming anecdote that added to his outlaw mystique. For Lila, that smoke never cleared. It choked her for the rest of her life. Lila Leeds died on September 15, 1999, at the age of 71. There was no breaking news alert, no tributes from the Academy. Her death was marked by a silence as profound as the noise that had surrounded her arrest. The few obituaries that ran committed the final indignity, identifying her primarily as Robert Mitchum's co-arrestee. Even in death, she was not allowed to be the protagonist of her own tragedy. She was merely a supporting character in his triumph. Today, if you drive up Laurel Canyon, past the winding roads and the multi-million-dollar mansions, the echoes of that night still linger. The exact spot where the cabin stood has been renovated and modernized, burying the ghosts of the past under layers of new paint. But the silence tells the story better than any headline. It is the silence of a girl who realized, too late, that she was sitting in a room full of smoke, waiting for a fire that was designed to burn only her. Robert Mitchum got the glory. Lila Leeds paid the price. He became a god of the silver screen, immortalized in celluloid. She became a statistic, a warning whispered to young girls stepping off the bus at Union Station. But in the end, it is Lila who haunts us. Mitchum is the face of Hollywood's triumph. Leeds is the face of its cruelty. She represents the terrifying truth of the dream factory. When the lights go out, some legends are born in the dark, while others are simply left there to die. History is written by the winners, but the truth often hides in the shadows. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, support our work by liking and subscribing. We are looking for our next investigation. Is there another star who was erased? Another crime that was covered up? Leave a name below. Let's bring them back into the light together.